the approach might be the problem as opposed to, your execution. And so my hope is that it's offered maybe a different way of looking at this and a different way of approaching the problem that is counterintuitive, in that maybe simplifying it is actually the right answer. Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. I'm joined today again by the lovely Kristen Kelly. Hi, Kristen.
Hi, Marcel. Nice to be here.
Likewise, I'm excited for today's conversation. We're talking about a fairly nuanced, but I think very important thing, which is forecasting and some different ways of thinking about forecasting that maybe are not as common as I think they should be.
Yeah. So really diving into forecasting, which is basically just having a sight line over a specific time horizon and be able to make decisions accordingly. And, we're going to talk about two kinds. As you mentioned, it's nuanced, so bottom up versus top down. Both of those views having utility, but for much different functions and often confused. So yeah, we're going to get into that.
Awesome. So why don't we start by just talking about, forecasting. Why is it so important? Why is everybody so obsessed with it? I think for good reason. And what are some of the challenges that people face and that we saw our clients face all the time when it comes to trying to get their needs met as it relates to forecasting?
Yeah, so I'll tee us off here. So I think that one of the main things with forecasting in terms of why it's a necessity for a service business in particular is so many of the metrics we need to measure requires that we understand a baseline and that we understand our business model so that we can project against it. So having a forecast is predicated upon, in other words, understanding what it is we're capable of achieving in the first place. So that's really just, I think, the true anchor point here for a forecast, and where we usually start, obviously, with our clients, just making sure that we've got a basis for reality that we're able to forecast against. What else would you add to that, Marcel?
Yeah, I would also say that fortunately or unfortunately, I guess this isn't really unique to service-based businesses, but it is prominent in service-based businesses where, like, one of the most important management functions in a service-based business is the balancing of capacity to work coming in. And that is an inherently sort of forward-looking exercise of, do we have the right amount of staff? How much work is coming in? Are we going to need to hire? Are we going to need to let people go? How much sort of flexible capacity do we keep around in the form of freelancers and contractors? Those are really, really important decisions. And the bigger an organization gets, the more important those things become, because the stakes get higher and higher and higher. As you talk about, let's say you have an agency with 100 people, you might be having 5 or 6 people a month come in and out of the team. That's just like a regular motion. And that might seem crazy to someone who's got 10 people on their team, but at scale, that's the level of implication. And so it becomes increasingly important, and an increasing amount of the leadership team's time becomes focused on that question as the company gets larger. But the other kind of piece of that, which is sort of very punishing, is the bigger the organization gets, the more expensive and cumbersome it becomes to maintain an understanding of what's happening in terms of capacity, because there's more moving pieces, there's more complexity to work through. And that's where I think system design gets really important, which is part of what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. And I think we've obviously touched on the capacity piece of the forecast, but another piece of forecasting obviously being revenue and AGI being an ingredient in terms of understanding, like that staffing question that you talked about, resourcing. It's really important for us to have a handle on what we're expecting from a capacity standpoint, but also AGI.
Yeah, this is sort of a bit of a nuanced thing, but it is important. I'm glad you brought it up, which is it is possible, and we've seen this before, to have your team be very well utilized, extremely busy, and for the business to still not be making money. And so it is definitely useful to have another view of this, which is looking at your capacity in terms of a financial lens as opposed to just, an hours lens. Both are important, both serve different purposes, but you should probably have both.
Yeah. So let's talk about the two vantage points that we've got when it comes to forecasting. Let's dig into it. We've got bottom up and top down. Again, utility in both and really complementary. But I think it's just important for us to maybe start by clarifying what both of these are.
Yeah. And I'll start by saying that, we're going to use this language of top-down forecasting a lot during this conversation. And it's very possible that like that concept has existed long before Parakeeto was around. But I like to think that we've sort of like coined that in this particular context. And so, yeah, what is the key difference? Well, let's start with the way that most people think about forecasting, and is the prominent way that forecasting is done in agencies and is done in software platforms that are trying to support this function, which is what we would define as bottom-up forecasting. And this is often the focus of a project or delivery sort of management team. And the question that they're trying to answer with that is often who's doing what and how busy are individual people on the team. That's sort of the first job. And that is accomplished generally by taking the work that needs to get done, whether that's projects or retainers or different client engagements, breaking those down into a series of task-based objects, and then assigning those task-based objects to individual contributors on the team. And so the benefit of that way of doing forecasting or resource planning is that it's very precise. And so we can get a very detailed view into exactly how busy every individual on the team is supposed to be at a given moment in time. However, the downside of it is that it is extremely precise, which means that let's imagine you have a team of 25 people and you have 50 different projects going on, and each of those projects has a couple hundred tasks on them. And there's inevitably things changing. Somebody quit last week. We're hiring a new person. This project's timeline got pushed around. Some clients changed the scope of this other thing. We lost a client. We won a new client, right? All of a sudden, you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of objects that need to be kept up to date at a given moment in time. And so that really starts to restrict the utility of bottom-up resource planning and forecasting when you start trying to use it to look at longer time horizons. So let's say we're trying to forecast the next month or the next 3 months or the next 6 months. And certainly as you try to get higher and higher levels of insight. So what does our busyness look like for this entire department or this function within our business or for the whole firm, for example? The dependency starts to become greater and greater, and the surface area for mistakes and the surface area of things that need to be maintained gets greater and greater and greater. And that's, of course, quite punishing when you have a lot of really precise, detailed things that need to be kept up to date. So that's sort of the idea with bottom up. Is awesome for project managers, delivery managers. That's sort of the purpose that it serves in the organization, is quite good at that. But where it starts to fall down is more at the leadership level, when we're asking bigger questions with more uncertainty over broader time horizons, which is where we like to propose top-down forecasting as the alternative method.
Yeah. And I think with bottom up forecasting, this is obviously for ops people or project managers, the kind of the default place to start, where you just have the system installed, you have your day-to-day workflow kind of contained. But then when it comes to trying to figure out what all of that actually means or what implications that has at the higher level, at the executive level, that's where, we're falling short. And that's where our project management tool is not the answer, not the sole answer.
Yeah. And so I think this is where there's like a trap that a lot of people fall into, which is they think about solving that next set of problems, which is, as an executive team, every couple of weeks, we sit down and we have this conversation that sounds a lot like, well, what if X happens? What if we win this client? What if we don't win this client? What if this client signs next month instead of this month? What if this client fires us? What if this person gets hired? What if this person quits? What if this person gets moved from this job to that job? And what if any combination of any of those things happens? And we're having a leadership conversation that is unfortunately based in inherent uncertainty, right? And so I think that's an important and specific set of language that I've just used. We are dealing with inherent uncertainty. And so the reason I say that is a lot of times what we're trying to do is we're trying to get answers to those questions by building up all of the little detailed bottom-up building blocks to that higher level. The challenge is every time we want to evaluate a different scenario where something changes, we often have dozens or hundreds of things that need to go get updated and changed in order to then reflect that new scenario that we're looking at. And so functionally, bottom-up resource planning is not really designed for dealing with uncertain circumstances. It's more designed for dealing with fairly certain circumstances. So we know that the client has signed the contract. There's a defined scope of work. We have an idea of who's going to be working on it. Like, that's a fairly mature place in the life cycle. and it's generally contained to a much smaller subsection. But when we're talking about the leadership level, we're dealing with the inherent reality of running a business, which is we don't actually know what's going to happen. And so we have to evaluate a range of scenarios and then make our best guess based on that information, and hopefully do so in a way that is creating alignment among the other stakeholders on the leadership team. So we're all saying, hey, we agree that this is our best guess, and we're agreeing to that together, and we're going to execute based on this set of assumptions. The reason I want to just pause here is oftentimes what I've seen is firms say, hey, this is really hard. Forecasting in this leadership context is hard. And the answer is, okay, well, try to reduce the level of uncertainty in your business. And okay, fair. Can you productize your services? Can you make your scopes of work more predictable? Can you make your pipeline more predictable? And to the extent that you can do those things, great. But there's a limit to that. And in some businesses, that there just isn't opportunity for that. And I think that it's the wrong answer, right? The wrong answer is don't try to make business unpredictable. That's kind of a fool's errand. The answer should be, how do we design a system for forecasting that handles uncertainty better and enables the inherent nature of that conversation, which is we don't know what's going to happen. And so we need to be able to quickly and fluidly analyze a whole bunch of different circumstances. So top-down forecasting proposes to solve that problem by reducing the level of precision in that forecasting system and essentially focusing on larger, sort of broader, less precise, but still accurate in that context ways of modeling future work. And the key way that we accomplish that is we don't estimate at individuals or tasks. We estimate at what we call role categories. So we take people, we assign them into role categories, and we take projects and we assign their work into role categories. So when something changes, we are evaluating that at the level of how does this change the number of, let's say, for example, design hours or project management hours or engineering hours that are required. And when we're forecasting at that level, right? How much capacity available for the whole business, and at this like one extra level of detail that doesn't go all the way into people and projects. And by doing that, we can cut the number of details that need to be kept up to date by an order of magnitude. We can go down to like a tenth of the complexity and therefore speed things up, make them 10 times faster to look at and enable that leadership conversation, which is very different than the sort of project management conversation that's happening day to day. That was a very long explanation, so we can double click on that if.
That was a good one. I think the important thing to latch on to here, I think, is the speed that a system like this or a forecast like this enables you to make a decision. So what used to be kind of like a very time consuming and impossible task, trying to figure out in your project management system. And also, on the flip side with finance, if you're trying to pass a scenario off to that team and maybe have them go run some numbers, spend some time with that, all very time consuming exercises and maybe not ultimately yielding the answer that we're looking for when we're just on the flip side looking at a top-down forecast that can tell us a directionally accurate answer in a matter of a couple minutes, and just by changing a couple of inputs we can arrive at a conclusion.
There's a couple of things that I want to just sort of add to this. So the first is just a very objective lens, and I did a LinkedIn post on this that I'll try to find and link in the show notes, but about why mathematically this makes sense. And essentially, if you think about the simple math, it's the concept is a reliability block diagram. And so that's like an engineering concept that essentially says an entire system is only as reliable as each individual part within the system. So let's imagine you had a car and there's 100 parts in the car, and each part has a 1% chance of failure at any given moment. Well, statistically, there is a 100% chance that car will fail at any given moment, right? So if like you roll the dice, chances are something in the car is going to be broken at any given moment in time, because you have 100 parts multiplied by that 1%. That's how you get to that outcome. So if you think about the difference between a top-down system and a bottom-up system, let's imagine you're doing a bottom-up resource plan and you have, 25 people on your team and you have 25 projects going on. And so those 25 projects each have 25 tasks multiplied by 25 people that they're assigned to. You have 15,000 objects that you're managing at any given moment in time. And if each of those has a 0.001% chance of being off, then like you still have a guarantee that the system is not going to be accurate at any given moment in time. And so that's just like a statistical reality of the more precise you make that system, the less likely it is to be up to date. And so what that forces you to do is say, okay, well, we're only going to keep this up to date for like the next 2 weeks. And we're only going to keep it up to date for projects that like we know are confirmed and that we have assigned SOW and they've reached a certain point of maturity. So you really have to ratchet down the scope in order to make that viable. Whereas with the top-down system, what we're saying is, okay, we're not going to look at individuals. We're not going to look at like tasks. We're going to simplify this and take that number of objects from 15,000 down to like maybe 150 and reduce the amount of time it takes to keep them up to date by making the input very, very simple. And in doing so, the likelihood now that that's still going to be accurate, even if we say we're going to zoom out and look at 3 months at a time, and we're going to consider the deals that are in our pipeline and that are kind of fluctuating all the time, it becomes much more viable. So that's sort of like for the type A's in the room that are like, why does this work? That's why. It's just math, right? It's like statistically you're setting yourself up for success if you use a simpler system that is less precise, but still just as accurate. And I would argue more accurate in the context of trying to answer the question of what is the range of possibilities within this system. And that sort of leads me to my second point on this, which is when you deal with uncertainty, the less accurate way of modeling things, or sorry, I should say the less precise way of modeling things is often more accurate. And so what I mean by that is if you were to ask me, hey, Marcel, what's the weather going to be like today? And I said, it's going to be, 73.6 degrees. Well, that's a very precise answer. But the real answer is probably, well, it's going to be somewhere between 68 and 76, depending on where you are, what the time of day is, if there's cloud cover, if there's not cloud cover, how the wind's going to, right? So like, although that's not a precise answer, it's more accurate. And so the reality is the further up the chain you go to the leadership level, the broader the time horizon you look at, and the more of the pipeline you start to look at, the more uncertainty there is. And so I think it's understanding that a regression in precision in that context is not actually a regression in accuracy. The reality is the answer is a range of possibilities. And so having a broader set of tools that you use to express that's more fluid is a more accurate way to look at that situation and answer questions in that context. And so it's understanding that like there's a big difference even in the nature of what that answer might look like, depending on what question you're asking. And the project manager asking different questions every day than you are as a leadership team. And so it makes sense that you would use a different method and a different tool to accomplish that outcome.
Yeah, I think you just hit on something important there with, people asking and answering different questions with these types of forecasts. So, the project manager, of course, needing to know who has spare capacity over the next day or so, next week or so, and then trying to load balance, things like that, versus the executive team who's looking at a really long time horizon and trying to look at resourcing and staffing from a much different perspective. And, so much so that a top-down forecast really includes just 3 main data points in the visualization. It's overall available capacity, how much of that is delivery, and then where does the planned work stack up against it? Really that simple, versus bottom up.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're often sort of abstracting that to, weeks, not necessarily days. We're abstracting that, like I said, to these broader buckets of like design time, engineering time, or in some cases, the simplest starting point might just be to look at it for like the whole business as a super simple starting point. And so if you think about like, what does your project entry and your project grid look like in that context? It's like, what's the project? How much are we being paid? When does it start? When does it end? Or if it's recurring, what month does it start? And then how many hours? That could just be one bucket. What's the total number of hours that we think this is going to take? Right. So like that's all you have to maintain compared to in the bottom up forecast, it's that plus that same information for 200 tasks. Right. It's just like, it's such an astronomical difference. And then similarly, you don't have to worry about who's actually doing this job or make guesses about who's actually doing this job. It's just like, we have an average sort of cost per hour for each of these, things. So we can do this from a financial perspective. And we have a team kind of composition that we maintain that tells us this is roughly how much time we have available across these different areas of the business. Or again, in the simplest option, this is how much time we have for the whole business.
Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com /toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. And with that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it.
So Marcel, even though these systems are in fact complementary, what is the utility in actually keeping those separate to some degree?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, because one of the traps that we see a lot of people fall into is they really try to force a relationship between top down and bottom up. And often what that ends up essentially looking like is, as soon as you link these things together, you're dependent on the bottom up system in order to get your top down visibility or your higher level visibility. And the reason people do that is that there's just a general aversion to, I don't want to have duplicate entry in our workflow. I don't want to have the team kind of putting the same information into multiple different places, or, entering it twice, or I don't want these sets of information to sort of get out of line with each other, or I want the information from one thing to flow into another thing, right? And I get that. It's a nice to have, but I think what people tend to underestimate is the cost and the implication of starting to create intrinsic links between these things. And for example, the moment that you intrinsically link your top down and bottom up forecast in such a way where it's like one updates the other, then essentially what you've done is you've coupled everything to the bottom up forecast. So in order for the top down view or this higher level view to be accurate, then all of the stuff in the bottom up view needs to be kept up to date. And that creates kind of a bad situation for all the stakeholders involved. So the leadership team is going to be generally unhappy because they're going to be expecting something that is completely unsustainable from the project management team. And even if the project management team does manage to keep the 7,000 tasks that they need to keep up to date in time for the leadership meeting, then as soon as the leadership team starts to have the conversation that they're going to have, which is, okay, but what about this, and what about this, and what about this, and what about this, they're not going to be able to fluidly run those scenarios because the system's not designed for it. And conversely, the project management team is going to be upset because they're going to be held to a scope of work in the bottom-up tool that is completely untenable and is likely not creating any value for them. They got what they needed looking at like the next 2 weeks, but now they're being asked to like look out over the next 3 months and deal with a bunch of projects that haven't even landed yet. And they're going to end up spending an inordinate amount of time on that. And so that's the cost of linking these things. And what's sort of backwards about it is the time that you save in like a little bit of duplicate entry in the systems, you're going to pay for it 10 times over in the ongoing cost of maintaining the system that has now been designed to be significantly more expensive to maintain. And so I think that that's sort of the underwriting that doesn't happen objectively enough around this. And the utility of keeping these things separate is that, yes, there's a bit of extra, perhaps duplication of work in some cases, but you're going to have two systems designed to do a specific job. Those scopes will be limited, and you won't have dependency between stakeholders with requirements that aren't really realistic. The last thing that I'll say about this is there are still ways to create a flow of information. And I think that this is useful because these things tend to serve a purpose at different times in the project lifecycle. So things will often show up in the top-down system first, because that's generally what you're going to use to deal with less mature work, meaning it's earlier in the sales process. And so you might start to like first frame it out and scope it out and kind of see roughly what it's going to look like in its early stages in the top-down system. And then once it reaches a certain milestone, like the SOW goes out or it's signed by the client, or, we have a scope of work that's been approved by management, then you might trigger a workflow where you say, okay, well, let's take what we know and push it into this next system. So you can gain some efficiency without going all the way down the path of saying these two things are linked now. And if one gets changed, then the other one has to change, because that is sort of like a path of no return.
Yeah, I think that it's a really good point in terms of the sequencing of things. So while they're not interconnected, the general scope that's reflected in the top-down forecast should also marry up and inform what's in the bottom-up, system. So the number of hours from a broad perspective that you're porting in, from an expectation standpoint, what are we estimating at a parent task level, for example, for something to take? Should all start with scope, get ported into our system, and then be handed off to the project manager.
Yeah. And I guess while we're on that subject, I'll speak to a couple of things I think are important here. Is then the worry that we have is there's usually a person in the organization that has this mentality, and these people are very useful. And it's the kind of person who's like, wait a second, there's been some changes to this project in the bottom up system, and now there's a discrepancy of 8 hours between like what's estimated in the project management system and what we have reflected in our top down system. And so they're like, we must remove those discrepancies. And maybe, but if that's a 9,000 hour project, it's not material, right? Again, remembering that like as long as the answer is precise enough at the bottom up level to get the question answered, and it's precise enough at the top level to get the question answered, then the materiality of those changes needs to get taken into consideration. It's not inherent that they need to match up perfectly. And the other thing that can be done there is there are ways that you can create summary reporting, compare those things to each other, catch material things, and hopefully you've got the processes with things like change orders where there are material and notable changes to the scope of work that gets tied in. So the appropriate systems get updated. But I think it's also important to call out that like it's not necessarily true that it's a problem if these things are not completely aligned all the time. That there's a certain amount of discrepancy that is immaterial depending on the context.
Yeah, that's a really important nuance. I think the main takeaway there is just the overall process, which so many agencies just don't have, sequentially a starting point that begins with the scope. How does that look? What impact does that have at a high level? And then, trickle downstream effects from there. Marcel, I'm wondering if for those that are actually watching this on YouTube might benefit from seeing a visual of some of the things that we're talking about.
Yeah. And I guess anybody that's listening to this on audio, you just go cry somewhere because you've been excluded from the cool demo. But yeah, I think that is a good idea. We'll just kind of share what it sort of looks like to do this kind of forecasting. So I'll just pull up a couple of examples here from our system. This is a shameless plug. And if you see this and you're like, wow, this seems really useful and I would like to use that, then you can book a call in parakeeto.com or using the link in the show notes. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen here. We're going to go through a quick demo of our system. And of course, if you are watching this on YouTube, or even if you're listening to it, maybe you're imagining how awesome it is and you want to talk to us about it, then I encourage you to do that by looking in the show notes. So what we're looking at here is a time-based overview of the team, a time-based forecast. And there's essentially three things being defined here. What is kind of our gross capacity? So all the time that's available theoretically across everyone on the team. This dark gray line, which shows us what is our delivery capacity. So all the time that's theoretically available for client work after we remove all the time that's not, that's allocated to things like internal work or time off. And then the blue line is telling us roughly how much time is needed for client work in a given period of time. And then from that, we can, of course, calculate our utilization, what we expect that to be into the future, and model that against our target and see, are we on track to, utilize the team at or above where we'd like them to be. And then the way that we break that down without going to the individual level is we use what we call role categories. So for this particular firm, we've defined that as design, development, strategy, client management, ad management. This could be anything for your firm, right? Whatever you would categorize your people and time into. And then what we're able to do is say, okay, well, what does this look like for each of these individual areas of the business? And we can combine them arbitrarily. So we could see here that like client management, we're properly staffed. Strategy, we're properly staffed. Development, we're properly staffed. But design, we're understaffed going forward. We have a role that we need to fill. We probably need some freelance help too. Ad management, kind of a similar spot. We have somebody leaving the team, but we have more work than the current team will be able to handle. And so this really helps us get an understanding as a management team of like directionally where the focus needs to be, where we might need some help, and to what degree that discrepancy might exist. And the way that we arrive at this is through two simple inputs. The first is what we call the project grid. So this is just sort of a list of our projects. Very simple. When does it start? When does it end? How much do we get paid? And how much time do we think this is going to take across these different categories that we've defined? And the second is what we call the payroll grid, which is a similar view for our team. So who's on the team? What category do they fall into? Roughly how much time do they spend? And using that information, we can look forward and very quickly model, what happens if somebody comes on or off the team, or if a project does or doesn't come on. So just as an example, if I add a project here, we'll see that it just takes a second. And now we can model what it looks like if that project does or doesn't come on. And if I wanted to change the hour estimator, I can do that without having to wade through a bunch of different tasks. And then, of course, the other component here is looking at this on a financial basis. So very similar visualization, but we have theoretically how much revenue could we earn in a given period of time? What is the cost of running the business? And how much revenue do we have planned? All driven from those same inputs. And so, of course, this sort of makes the game very easy, which is keep this blue line above the red as close to the gray as we can without going over too much for too long. And if we do that, everyone's happy. And so this is sort of an example of how we do top-down forecasting with our clients, what some of these visualizations look like. They're very simple, but again, geared towards this leadership conversation and very quick ability to model things. Okay, so that was like a quick demonstration of, an example of what top-down forecasting looks like. And of course, the main purpose of that is not to like sell you our stuff. It's to sort of try to make this feel tactical and objective, so you can look and like see what it actually looks like to do this. But of course, if the byproduct is you think that's awesome and you want to buy it, then by all means, you'll be able to find ways to speak to us in and around where you're listening to this or watching this.
Yeah, so if I'm an owner or an operator listening to this, Marcel, and I just want to get started, kind of test the waters in formulating something like this on my own, where would you say a good place to start is?
Yeah. When you think about what a lot of what we just showed you is at a basic level, it's basically a grid. And that grid has two components to it. One component is capacity. The other component is planned work. And so this might, the starting point for this might just be to essentially build a table that says, who's everybody on my team? What category would I put their time into? And figure out what is my weekly capacity, let's say, across a couple of simple buckets in the business. And then do the same thing with your projects. What are all my projects and how much time each week do I believe needs to be allocated to each of these different areas? And once you have those two tables, you can create the graphs that I just showed you. The only downside is you need to update that in a very similar way that you would update a resource plan, which is if the scope of the project changes, well, now I have to go back and update every single week, right? So the modeling that I just showed you is, of course, more nuanced. It required, like we had to write code to do that. But if you want to just validate that this visualization is helpful, that would be the simple starting point, is to just sort of like build a week by week grid that one handles capacity, the other one handles planned work. And maybe even just start with the total capacity for the team and the total hours per week for each project and use that as a starting point. And it's very possible that if you're using a bottom-up resource planning tool, there may be some ways that you can kind of hack into that a sort of higher level view or some way of sort of rolling these things up. And I know increasingly some of these tools are trying to make that kind of abstracted view a little bit more accessible. There's mixed results on that, but that's where I would start is, can you create a system where you're really abstracting this away from tasks and estimating at a much higher level?
And what's the frequency that you recommend a team kind of maintain or check in on this at?
It's a good question. And I think it has a lot to do with the nature of their business. And what I mean by that is if you're in an agency where you do a lot of like a very high volume of small, quick turn projects, then your cadence is probably going to have to be a lot tighter on this. You might need to look at it weekly or bi-weekly. Whereas if you are in, just to paint the other side of this picture, if you're in an agency that works on massive enterprise projects that take years to complete, you probably don't need to look at this quite as often. So I think you have to titrate this based on the pace of change and the amount of fluctuation that's occurring both in the work that's being done and coming into the business, as well as the team that's in the business as well. So turnover and how often your team is changing is also a factor you need to include. I would say for most firms, if you just started with like a bi-weekly cadence, that's probably a safe spot to start. And I would iterate from there.
So all this is really helpful, I think, and a good, springboard for someone who maybe hasn't installed a system like this into their agency. Maybe they've got bottom up, and they're really just looking for that additional insight and clarity, especially at the executive level. So, where can they go to find out more about Parakeeto?
Yeah, of course, if you want to speak to us and learn more about the platform and get more, in-depth demonstration of how it works and how it could work for you, then of course I encourage you to book a consultation here on the site. but or at parakeeto.com. I think the key takeaway, and I hope what people glean from this today, is if you've been frustrated, because I think this is what we hear from a lot of people, is they've spent years trying to close this gap, and they feel like no matter how hard they try, no matter how on top of their team they are, no matter how many different tools they kind of switch around to, that they still don't feel like they have the visibility that they crave, in particular at the leadership level. And I hope that if there's one takeaway from this, know that it's probably not a lack of effort. It's probably not a lack of intention or competency on your team. It's likely that you've just been set up for failure and using the wrong tools to try to do this job. And hopefully what this has helped you maybe reframe is that the approach might be the problem as opposed to, your execution. And so my hope is that it's offered maybe a different way of looking at this and a different way of approaching the problem that is counterintuitive, in that maybe simplifying it is actually the right answer.
So for more information,
Parakeeto.com. Yeah. And we've got, of course, the toolkit. There's more useful stuff in there, particular around estimation. And we'd be happy to speak to you if you have more questions. So with that, thank you for tuning in. And I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. We'll see you on the next one.
See you next time.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day, because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.